So, welcome to the lecture, The Principles of Design. So in this lecture, we're going to talking about balance, and this is visual balance that we're talking about. So symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and radial balance. And we'll see examples of all of the things we're talking about. Emphasis and focal point, and we'll get kind of a deep dive into Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, scale and proportion, and in that one, we'll talk about Judith Baca's La Memoria de Nuestra Tierra, the memorial for the new land. Repetition and rhythm, unity and variety, and we'll talk about one more thing in the critical process. So this is Leonardo's The Canon of Human Proportions. And in this one, he's basically trying to set up the principles of what he thinks is good design. So in this, he talks about balance, emphasis, proportion and scale, rhythm, repetition, and unity and variety. And the thing that you can see the best in this picture, he puts a square and a circle, and he puts his human figure in it. He's really talking about proportions. So the length of the arms, and you can see how it breaks up the arm into separate segments, and the length of the legs, again, breaking up into segments. And then another segment for the head, and fitting everything into this circle and square. So this is Frank Gehry, and this is his Gehry house. And I'm laughing because it's a little bit of a troll, I would say. So Frank Gehry, like a lot of architects when he first started, you're not necessarily getting a bunch of clients that are running to you. So when he made the Gehry house, this is actually the house he's going to live in. And it was one of those houses when I was younger, I used to call them plastic lands. They're houses where they're neighborhoods where all the houses are exactly the same. They have the same exterior color and such. So on this one, he wanted to take one of those neighborhoods, started to live in a house in that neighborhood and break all the rules, not just of the neighborhood, but rules of design in general. So when you look at the house, it just has random angles and corners going in all different directions. There's no unity with the house, within the house, or with the neighborhood. So sometimes people learn rules like Leonardo had, and then break them as much as they can. And that's definitely what Frank Gehry wanted to do here. So balance. There's a couple of different ways that artists, well, a few different ways that artists can use balance. In this one, this is Vermeer, who's a Dutch painter from the 17th century, and it's his woman holding a balance. And in it, even though we have a literal woman holding a balance, we can see it right here. And this balance would be used to weigh like jewelry or something like that, hence the jewelry in the picture. He's talking about visual balance. So we have the head and the figure over here. And then it's not exactly balanced out, but we do have some light coming out of the window and some dark areas here that are relatively balanced to the space taken by the figure. So these scales, like they're literally scales that are used for jewelry, but they could represent a lot of different ideas. He has a painting of the Last Judgment in the background. And the Last Judgment, if you're not familiar, is from the book of Revelation. And it talks about the end of the world where Jesus Christ is going to return to the earth. And then he's going to judge the souls of people, whether they go to heaven or hell. And often when that is pictured, they'll show scales of literally weighing the souls to see how much sin they have on them. It could also represent the scales of justice. So those types of pictures you would see, like they're in some of the iconography or propaganda, depending on how you look at it, of the United States, but also extensively used in France. So it could represent that as well, or it could represent both, which I think is more likely. So in this one, we have what's called absolute symmetry. So absolute symmetry means you can draw a line down the middle and it's almost exactly the same on each side. So we can see that we have a group of figures and another group of figures over here, equally the same size. We put the line in the middle and we have Jesus on the cross. Then we have the concept of the Trinity here. We have, but it's both portraying different parts of God as a young man. So this would be God the Father and God the Son. And then in the middle, we have a dove that represents the Holy Spirit. And even the dove is symmetrical with absolute symmetry itself. And then when you look in the bottom, you can see similar things. Not quite exact absolute symmetry on the bottom, but very close. So this symmetry is used here to represent different types of separations where they're trying to balance out the ideas, and they do that through visual balance. So Jerusalem and Rome. So Rome would represent something that is kind of like not exactly good, but not exactly bad, but definitely the old ways. And then Jerusalem would be the new ways. And then God and Jesus, and purgatory and hell. So purgatory would be the souls go that are good souls, but haven't found the salvation of Jesus. And then hell would be where the bad souls go. So that's over here. So generally, when you look at these, you look at the figure and then you think of it from their point of view. The things that are in the left are usually the more bad things. So we have hell over here, and then the things on the right from the figure's point of view are the more good things. So there's also asymmetrical balance. And in this case, the asymmetrical balance is literally balance because we're talking about a three-dimensional object. And this is Nancy Graves' hindsight. Asymmetrical balance means a balance achieved in a composition when neither side reflects or mirrors the other. So if you draw a line down the middle of this piece, it's pretty much completely different on each side. Despite that, it actually stands up. So it is balance. It's just asymmetrical. So a couple different ways you can use asymmetry is you can kind of think of the visual balance as being a literal balance because our eye tends to see that. So you could think of the middle of your picture or wherever you want to set the fulcrum. And if you have a lot of stuff close in the middle, then you need more stuff. If you don't have a lot of stuff on the other side, then you need to put it out towards the edge. So something like this would be literally balanced, assuming that these two circles are made out of the same stuff. And that's a way to get balance. So another way you could do that is you could have two smaller areas and they balance the big area here. You could have a filled area and that seems to have more weight, kind of like what we saw in the Vermeer picture. But if it's more light colors or doesn't have a lot of visual weight, then you can put it out towards the edge. So balance it just as you would with a smaller object. And then a large light area would be balanced at the same spot by a smaller dark area. So a bunch of different ways, and artists can use this as kind of shorthand to create some visual balance, but have different things on each side of the picture. So this one, you can see it's a little stripy, so it's got some stuff in it, a textured area, and then the plain area with not a lot of color would be out towards the edge again. So this is an example of that sort of thing, an asymmetrical balance. The central axis is going along here. And the reason why we would read it that way is what we were talking about with perspective before. All the lines of go towards a vanishing point that's about there. And we have lots of dark items over here, which are kind of close. And then we have lighter areas that go out farther. So using that same idea where if you want to balance things out visually, if you have light areas, you have to have more of it. If you have dark areas, you can have less of it. Or light areas, you have to have it farther away from the center point. And dark areas, you can keep it closer to the center point and still have some balance. So it's an example of this type of balance, more or less. And then there's radial balance, which is in some ways like kind of the easiest and the most intuitive because it's kind of like absolute symmetry, except you're doing everything in a circle. So we have in this one, which is a rose window in the west facade in Chartres Cathedral in France. And we have Jesus in the middle. And then we have these 12 little circles. Those are the 12 apostles. Then we have 24 circles. Well, sometimes there'll be 24 circles. I don't think there is in this case, but you have circles that are going out that are kind of all leading towards the center. You can almost imagine all of them radiating out of the center, so hence radial balance. A circular composition in which the elements project outward from a central core at regular intervals like spokes on the wheel. So you can imagine using this as a wheel would be a pretty fancy one, and rolling down the street with that, and it would be stable. So again, kind of making a connection between visual balance and something that if it was made out of real stuff, would also be balanced. So emphasis and focal point. And this is one of those things where I ask you, what is the focal point? So you might want to pause, and how you can usually tell the focal point is what's the first thing you look at. So pause it and like write down or just think about what's the first thing you look at. Okay, cool. So we're back. And I would say that most people look at the lobster first. And there's a couple of reasons why. The lobster is in the center. And even though there's like a lot of stuff, kind of space at the top of the picture, it's dark and there's nothing there. So it seems to be in the center. It's also bright, bright red. And red is one of those colors that are almost universal. They'll get the attention of anybody. So that's part of the reason why you're looking at this particular thing. So a lot of times the artists, and this is Anna Valier Coster on A Still Life with Lobster. And in this one, she's trying to put our focus on the lobster. And by this time, 1781, the lobster was considered to be a luxury item. You can also see that with fruit. And basically, these types of paintings, and if you're ever down to Toledo Museum of Art, you can see in person, these types of paintings are supposed to express the idea that, sure, you can have these luxuries in life, but from a Christian point of view, the afterlife is much longer. So maybe think about how you can be a good person on this earth instead of acquiring lots of luxuries. So in this one, Georges de la Tour, I think it's pretty obvious what you're looking at first. You're looking right at this light, this bright light right here. And it shows Joseph the carpenter. So if you're thinking this is Joseph the carpenter, that's Jesus's dad. So this would be a young Jesus right here. So it puts you right in the scene. You can look at Jesus's face and you can see that he's looking at Joseph, and then Joseph is looking at his work. Maybe that's why Jesus didn't become a carpenter. He was just looking at his dad instead of the work. So that's why he didn't learn it. But it does give us a focus. And because there's just one bright light and lots of darkness, creates a kind of drama to it, just like you would use in a play where you have a spotlight when you want things to look dramatic. So in this one, I'll ask you to pausing and say, where do you look first? Okay, so if you're back, I'll tell you what most people say. They say right there. And part of the reason why is we're kind of making an X. When people want to look at X's, they say X marks the spot. We can also see all these lines leading up towards the swords. And then we have 3 arches, and this happens to be right in the middle. So we want to look at things, sometimes they're right in the middle. So what Jacques-Louis David is telling you in the Oath of the Horatii is this is the most important part. And this isn't as important because we can kind of see how it's lower down, and that's the thing you look at afterwards. So the story of this painting helps you understand to why David, who's writing at the time when people in France are hoping to have a revolution against the monarchy and replace it with a Republican government. If you're not familiar with what a Republican government is, that's where you elect representatives. So that's more or less what the United States is. But the story is from ancient Rome, and it's about the Horatii versus the Curatii. And there's some families that have a bunch of conflicts, and they realize that they can't do the things that they need to do with these kinds of conflicts. But they have certain things that they won't compromise on. So they decide that they're going to have a fight to the death with heroes from each of the families. And here's our 3 heroes from the Horatii, and that's Horatius in the middle, against the heroes of the Curatii to the death. And whoever wins, then they can get what they want in the dispute that they have, and they can stop fighting. So you can see right here that this potential sacrifice that the young Horatii want to make, and they're kind of pledging to their father, Horatius, um, that it is kind of the most important thing because that's the first thing we look at. On the side, the story gets a little deeper. One of the figures in here is one of the Horatius's daughters, and she happens to be dating one of the men from the other family, from the Curatii. So that's partially why she's sad, but also she could possibly lose one of her brothers, and her mother is here as well. She could lose one of her sons. So you can see her kind of like grasping onto her younger sons right there. So and Davi does a couple of other things to kind of like emphasize there's all straight lines here and then all curved lines here. And for this, and this is kind of sexist, just a warning, or definitely part of the patriarchy, is the idea that straight lines mean rationality and curved lines mean something that's emotional and irrational, perhaps. And from in Western culture, irrationality has been associated with women and rationality with men. Um, if you're a woman living today, you may think that that's not the case. And I would agree with you. Um, so he's saying that this sacrifice that they're making through violence is more important than the emotions they have for losing people close to them. I can't imagine that because I would be more on the woman's side in this particular case. But when you think of it in the context of Davi's culture, he looks at it like this: to be able to topple the monarchy, it's going to take violence. Some people are going to get killed. But for him, being able to create what he believes to be a rational government, so a Republican government, is worth the sacrifice. So you can see how artists can use emphasis to tell us what they think is important, and how that leads to the content. So form leads to content in this case. So you can see how he had another part of the picture where we have a different kind of balance. The focal point is shifted upwards. We have a bunch of figures over here that are lighter, and then this kind of pyramid that leads up to the victorious Horatius's son. And he's looking pretty proud of himself right there. So this is an early sketch for a painting, and the painting ended up a little bit different than that. So sometimes artists, they don't want you to focus on anything in particular. And in the case of this one, Larry Poons, who's an op artist, and I'll talk about op art a little bit later, but it's short for optical art. In his Orange Crush, he wants us to not look at anything in particular. So you're probably spending some time looking at this image. And by this point, and I'm already seeing it, you'll notice that you don't really want to look at anything at all. Your eyes keep darting around. And when they do, you start to see additional orange dots that are in the orange field. So he's taking advantage of that phenomenon that we talked about before. He's got an orange background and then green dots in here, or blue dots, depending on how you see these colors. And so those are really hard opposites, and he has really, a very consistent color throughout and very hard barriers between the colors. We tend to want to see the opposite color. And that's what you see in the field. And I'm pointing to dots that you may or may not see. It depends on how your eyes work. So we call this kind of piece where your eye doesn't land anywhere in particular and just keeps moving around, afocal. So sometimes artists can use these types of techniques for focus in very, very complex ways. So this is Diego Velasquez's The Maids of Honor. So again, I'll ask you to pause, and what's the first thing you look at? So if you're back, most people, the first thing they look at is the little girl. Part of the reason why she's in the center, the most light is on her. But notice what she is looking at and what most of the other people in the picture are looking at. We see this figure who is a portrait of Velasquez himself. And the little person right here, and the person in the background, and then the person in the far background. So who are they looking at? So Velasquez is doing a little bit of a trick. Like he knows that people are going to look at this first, but he also knows if they keep looking, they may start to wonder, well, if this is the focal point, why is everybody looking at something else? Some of the figures are looking at the little girl, but some of them aren't. So this little girl is Princess Margarita, no relation to the drink, who is King Philip's daughter. And at this time, he's Philip the Fourth of Spain. He was the most powerful ruler in Europe, and one of the most powerful rulers in the world at this particular time in the 17th century. His From Spain, he wasn't Spanish himself. He was a member of the Habsburg family. From Spain, they expanded out into the Mediterranean, and into the Netherlands, in a place that's called Belgium, and had taken over a wide area. So this is a very, very powerful man. And he's painting this for the office of Philip the Fourth. So if you notice, Velasquez is working on this giant painting. We can see it right here. And this painting itself is pretty huge as well. So then you start to think, well, who are they looking at and who is he painting? And in that case, you can think of this thing in the background as either another painting, or imagine yourself in the place of someone who is being looked at by all the figures. And then imagine this was a mirror and how you would look in that mirror. And then when you look at this, if you get it kind of close, you can see that it looks very much like Philip and his wife. And part of the reason you tell it's Philip because he had this huge chin. So her parents, the king and the queen, are portrayed here, and you can think of it as a painting, but since it's lit up, you can also think of it as a mirror. So he's using this focal point to kind of move us forward and say, yeah, this is a picture of the kids. Well, the kid, and she's very important. But the king and the queen, and especially the king, who's a little bit bigger in this picture, are the most important. So this is a picture of the king. Habsburg family, maybe perhaps not the best looking family. So scale and proportion. And here I am, like the Frank Gehry example, giving you a very extreme example. This is Gel Sapira, and this is Untitled. And you can tell that the scale is off on this because we know how floors look and what the scale of floorboards are. And we know how big chairs should look next to this. And this is just this tiny looking dollhouse chair. So he's really getting you to focus on this strangeness and proportion and making you wonder, like, who is going to sit in that? Must be a super small person. So scale, the dimensions of an art object in relation to the original object that it depicts or in relation to objects around it. And I would also add to that our expectations of the size of the object, which is what Joel Shapiro is working with this one. So you can go the other way with Klaus Oldenburg and his trowel. And you can see from the person right here, this is not a usable trowel for someone in a garden, but maybe there's giants. So we have in the previous one, we have like a tiny, tiny little scale. And in this one, we have an exaggerated scale in the other direction. It just has this hugeness. So I like this one a lot. I actually saw it in a movie that was an animated movie recently, and they kind of put this in the background, which I thought was interesting. This is Spoon Bridge and Cherry. And I think when people look at this picture, they start to think, well, where's the milkshake? I want to put my cherry in the milkshake. But it's this giant spoon. So Oldenburg kind of likes to do what a lot of other pop artists do. And we'll talk about pop art later when we get to art history section, where he wants to kind of set up that things that we do in the everyday are really cool and kind of important. So speaking of importance, we kind of get some of those effects here with John Singer Sargent and the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, I guess. Not sure how you pronounce this guy's name because I only know Singer Sargent. And in this one, we see obviously a pretty wealthy family. You can see they have all this like fancy stuff. And he's using proportion again in a kind of strange way. We see these girls, some are a little bit older. They have the super little girl with her doll on the floor, but they're standing next to these vases that are just huge. They're bigger than them. So proportion is the relationship between an object and the whole, or the relationship between an object and its surroundings. So the kids are pretty small in this one, but they're bigger than this little girl who's looking straight at us. And as they get older, they kind of disappear more and more into the background and into the shadows. And so Henry James, he looked at this picture and he says this is about assimilated secrets. So the idea that when you're a really young child, and if you know anyone, it's a toddler, you kind of know they just blab everything and say everything. But as kids get older, they want to get a little bit more independent. So we see her standing by herself. And then when they get even older, they want to get a little bit of secrecy from adults and be able to do their own things with other teenagers. So we see two teenagers together. But by adding the vases, we still see, they're not grown-ups yet. They're still kids, even though they think they might be getting towards being a grown-up. So you can use proportion in very interesting ways to tell little stories. This is Charles Simmons, and it's his dwelling series. And he actually made these 200 of them in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He's made a bunch of other projects like this since then, and 100 more from Ireland to China. And what he thought of is he's like, these are little people cities, like the ruins of ancient little people cities. So these are basically the sizes of doll houses. And he would just randomly put them into the corner of walls in street corners. And what he noticed is over time, and he had it set up so that there'd be photographers after he put it out would be nearby so they could take pictures. One of the pictures he got was this. So he's got a little people ruined city right in here. So a big city sitting in this spot. What he noticed after time is that kids were usually be more interested in these little people cities than grown-ups. And part of the reason why is if you are a grown-up, you probably think about you're pretty busy and you're going from place to place and you're not necessarily paying attention to things that are around you. When you're younger, you may be less busy and you may pay attention a lot more. And he found that kids were often finding the little people cities, and that sometimes people would take little pieces of the little people cities, like they were Indiana Jones archaeologists finding something, and they would take artifacts from the little people cities. Um, so it was kind of an interesting experiment. It tells just as much about the people who find them and the viewers of things as it does about the art itself. So in this one, this is Hoku size, and I'm sure you've seen this picture. It's one of the most famous pictures. It's kind of iconographic, meaning a symbol of Japanese art for people outside of Japan. But it also includes a symbol that's very important for the Japanese people. It's Mount Fuji. So this one's called the Great Wave at Kanagawa. Sometimes it says off Kanagawa, and that's a bay in modern day Tokyo. It was called Edo at this time. It's from his series 36 Views of Mount Fuji. So Mount Fuji is this beautiful, kind of like pyramidal dome of a volcano. And it erupted in 1707, but there weren't any ancient Japanese records of it erupting before. So people just thought of it as this beautiful mountain that was kind of unchanging. It would have snow or less snow. But all of a sudden, in 1707, they realized this symbol of immortality is actually can change very quickly, and it can also be dangerous. So it kept erupting over time, and it became a symbol of something that Japanese people already believed that was kind of integrated into Japanese culture. And the idea that, yes, things can last a long time, but things are always changing, and you have to be able to deal with the changes. There's also this other idea in Japanese culture that's kind of expressed by the men in the boats. So when you look at this, I usually ask my classes, what do you think is going to happen to them? Are they going to make it? And sometimes students say, yeah, they'll make it, but other ones say, nope, they're going down. They're never going to make it. But as you can see, they're all being despite this maybe impossible situation, they're being very disciplined. They're getting low in the boat so they'll be less likely to overturn and trying to save themselves from getting overturned or perhaps washed out by the wave. So this speaks to what you have to do if you live in an area where there are volcanoes, earthquakes, which there are many in Japan, and then earthquakes cause tsunamis, of which there have been many dangerous ones in Japan. And if you live in a place like this, you kind of have to know how to deal with these almost impossible situations. Um, so it talks about the idea of discipline and persistence in the face of violence. And it's also talking about the eternity. Remember, Mount Fuji used to be a symbol of eternity and then being completely in the moment at the same time. So he uses scale. We see this like mountainous wave, and it's a larger than the 12,000-foot mountain in the background. So we see that the moment in this case is far more important than the much larger thing in the background. So he's using scale again, and to kind of like uh, proportion to kind of show us what is important. You got to focus on the now, even though you're in front of this beautiful eternity. So in this one, Pablo Picasso, it's called Women with a Stiletto, but it's his version of the death of Marat. And I'll show you the original picture in a moment. Hint, it doesn't look like the original picture. But in some ways, it's like some students perceive it to be more disturbing and more like an event like this would actually be. So what it's showing is the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, who was one of the journalists and writers of the French Revolution. So after his death, he was considered a hero, but he was always already considered to be an important revolutionary. And the assassination by Charlotte Corday, who is thought to have been a loyalist to the monarchy. So what she did is she sent a letter and said, I believe in your cause to Davi. And then she came up to his house and people were worried because, you know, people had tried to attack Marat before. And like Marat, he had this kind of skin condition. So he had to stay in a bathtub and he actually wrote in a bathtub. We'll see exactly what it looks like in a moment. So the people that were at his house, they took the letter from Charlotte Corday and they showed it to Marat and he said, yeah, bring her up. I mean, I'll listen to her. And when she got there, she pulled out a stiletto, which is basically a very sharp type of knife, and stabbed him in the heart and killed him. And in this one, we can see that Picasso is portraying Charlotte Corday as this monstrous figure. It's very scary, much larger than we see from Marat, who has this tiny little head. And the only thing that's big on him is his arm that's kind of laying out and his foot that is laying out of the tub. So if we look at the next one, we can see something that has very harmonious proportions. So we have some stuff at the bottom, and our eye kind of leads gently to the face of Marat, who looks like he just fell off to sleep. And we see the wound, the stab wound, and a little bit of blood, but we don't see the kind of horror of the previous one. So a lot of people perceive this to be, wow, this doesn't really show the violence of the event in the same way that the Picasso does. So sometimes when artists use kind of monstrous proportions like Picasso did, you can make things look more realistic in a way by showing, especially if it's a violent event. So in this one, this is Polykleitos, who's an ancient Greek sculptor. This is Doryphoros, which means spear bearer. Spear's gone. This is actually a Roman copy. The original would have been done in bronze. And speaking of balance, it would have stood up on its own. But when you make something out of marble, it doesn't work as well as bronze. So you have to have these attachments to stop it from falling over, basically. And he's using a system called a canon, which is a set of ideal proportions. And the ancient Greeks, they believed basically in the maxim with their art, if it looks good, it represents good. So a couple of things look good about this picture. The first thing is that the ancient Greeks saw the male nude as being heroic. And that's because one of the most important things in ancient Greeks was the Olympics. They would have the Olympic Games every 4 years. And during that time, the Greek city states who were always fighting amongst each other, they would stop fighting and they would compete in these games. And over time, some of the men in these games became basically professional athletes. And they were seen as being these like kind of supermen or whatnot. Um, but because of its importance to Greek culture, ancient Greek year zero starts with the first Olympic Games. These men were considered to be heroic and a symbol of all that is good. They competed in the nude in the Olympics. So as a result, the male nude became associated with things that are good. Another way that he does this is a lot of ancient Greek philosophers were also interested in mathematics and geometry. And some of them believe that when you have proportions that are considered to be perfect in a mathematical way, that they could get you closer to either the idea of what is good and perfect, um, or even closer to God in some of the more mystical strains. So this one, Polykleitos, basically sets up a canon of proportions where a person is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heads tall. And all the other artists thought this was a really good proportion. It looked good. So if it looks good, it is good. So everybody copied this canon of proportions. In later times, they actually changed it to ancient Greek artists a couple hundred years later, or actually only 100 years later, changed it to 8 heads. So the heads would be much smaller. So sometimes people give a meaning to certain types of proportions. And that's certainly the case with the ancient Greeks. So we have the same thing here. This one actually isn't the golden section. I should take that out of this lecture. But the width is about 1.6 times the height, about 5 to 8. And these types of proportions were considered to be very pleasing. So the Parthenon is another ancient Greek building. So works in progress. We have a few things going on with this with Judith Baca's La Memoria di Nuestra Tierra. Remember, that means the memorial of the new land. And it was inspired by Mexican Revolution artists. So in Mexico, there was a revolution against the current Mexican government. And it was a socialist revolution. And they won. And when they did, they started funding artists to express some of the ideas that they thought were better for regular folks. So ideas that are against imperialists, ideas that raise up the tradition of Mexico, so certain parts of Mayan and Aztec cultures, and ideas that show if people work together, they can fight to make a better world. So Baca is influenced by that style of art. Some of the examples of art you can see if you're ever in the Detroit Institute of Art, you can see a great piece by Diego Rivera. Just ask anyone that works at the museum where the Diego Rivera is, and they'll show you. You'll see a whole room of paintings, and also Siqueiros and Orozco. And the idea with this one is kind of similar to what the Mexican Revolution artist wanted to do. She wanted to give voices to marginalized communities. So for she's doing this at the USC, so University of Southern California. And there's lots of Mexican students. So Chicano means Mexican American. It sometimes can mean Mexican Americans that live in the West Coast, but nowadays most people apply it just to all Mexicans that live in the United States. And she talked about how they would live a different kind of life and have different types of oppressions. So in their own neighborhoods, they would have a stronger police presence. They would have sometimes, if they're trying to get jobs, they would be accused of being in the country illegally. And when people did come in the country illegally, they were treated awfully. So she does this to create, kind of show some of the ways that people are, you can see right here with the raised fist coming together to fight their own oppression. You can see some of the old Aztec gods that are kind of in the land, who Mexican people are. Every Mexican person is part Spanish and then part Native American, so Mayan or Aztec. So showing how the land belongs to them, despite the people that are in power in California or in Mexico. And she shows things like the highway system, which is very important in California, made it possible for it to exist. And it was mostly built by immigrant labor from Mexico and Central America. And you can see on here a hanging figure. And what this symbolizes is the lynching of Mexican Americans. So many times at the border, but sometimes by people who were saying that the Mexicans are taking away our jobs. And this was a long time ago, in the early 20th century and in the 19th centuries. But as you know, you can just look around the United States and see that some people still treat Mexican immigrants or immigrants from Latin America in general in horrible ways, including our own government. So she's trying to tell some of the stories, how people can fight the oppressions they had, some of their grand histories, and putting them all together into a picture, and using proportions. So to give us like an idea of what's going on, we can see the graves here representing people that died trying to come to this country. So you may notice that the lynching was removed in this one, although it's very dark here, because USC administration said like we didn't want to have this in it. And Judith Bach and her students fought really hard to keep it in it, but they refused to allow them to paint it in a student topping center with it. But she was able to still include almost all of the other elements in it, including the graves, and was still able to make a picture that told the story. So this picture you can see is 9 feet by 23 feet. So a massive scale to the point where some of these figures are human sized. And then the ancient Aztecs are even larger than human size. So repetition and rhythm. Jacob Lawrence was really fond of using rhythmic techniques through repetition. When you think of rhythm, so we were talking about balance, we were talking about like physical things, and I showed you a balance. If you think of rhythms, think of music. A lot of times when people play music, if it's like a dance song, you want to have a really steady rhythm. And the rhythm will be repetitive so that people can dance to it. They can kind of understand it. So Jacob Lawrence would think about that and think about Black American music, which is the source of Black American music, so the source of all pop musics around the world, and showing how it can relate to other parts of Black American culture. So showing a bunch of men at the barbershop and using repetitive imagery and shapes to kind of create a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a rhythm right there. So rhythm, in effect, achieved with shapes, colors, or regular pattern of any kind is repeated over and over again. So Lawrence talks about how when he would go to the barbershop, everything seemed to almost progress in a rhythm. Like everybody would know what they're doing. Like the haircut would progress in a certain rhythm. Like when you walk in, you say hi, everyone says hi. Not necessarily using the word hi. How you pay everyone, and it's just this kind of like machine that's working. And he thought it was really appealing and tried to portray that in this picture. So in Rodin's The Gates of Hell with Adam and Eve, in this one, he's using rhythm to express a bunch of different ideas. So this one, The Gates of Hell with Adam and Eve, is exactly what you would expect it to be. It's about someone standing over hell. You can see that right here. And the three shades, which are above, are all the same. He basically like took the same figure and then just welded them together. So they show that like even though there's differences, sometimes people who are going to hell are kind of dealing with the same types of situations. Could also perhaps represent the Trinity, which is the idea amongst Christians that God is one God in three parts. You may recognize something we looked at, or I'm not sure if you have in this class, the thinker, which is originally intended to be on this Gates of Hell. The Gates of Hell were never actually made during Rodin's lifetime, but he is using a lot of repetition to give us like kind of a scary effect. So unity and variety. This is James Lavadour's Seven Valleys and Five Valleys. It's stylistically unified. So he's doing a picture in the Southwest of the United States and showing how you can have similarities even if you're in different places. And it creates this rhythm. It's almost like you're taking a trip, kind of like what we see with Jacob Lawrence's picture. You can imagine the progression of the haircuts and how things are working over time in the barbershop. You can imagine going on a hike and seeing all these different areas here. So he makes them all the same by giving us that idea. This is all happening in the same day, and maybe some other parts, some rain rolled in or something like that. So it's unified in such a way for us to kind of think of as them as being all related. So sometimes artists will use rhythm in an almost arbitrary way, in a way that can be just a way to do something new, but it can also represent the type of world that you live in. So Jean-Michel Basquiat, he lived in New York City. He was living in Manhattan or Brooklyn, I think, at this time. And if you've ever been to New York City, no matter where you go, there tends to be a lot going on. There isn't like things that you can necessarily focus on. Your attention is being taken in all different directions. So even though Jean-Michel Basquiat is creating kind of a new effect, and that's part of why he was popular, it's also an effect that represents in a way the types of things that he would see when he was growing up and if he went outside and started walking around. So his arbitrary words, it's anti-unity. We don't see any unity because the places that he goes around every day, they're all built by different people, and unity isn't really a thing. So he's part of the postmodernist artists a lot who were interested in disjunction, trying to represent the world as they saw it, as being relatively disorganized. So Las Vegas, Nevada is probably a good example of this postmodernist disjunction. So Las Vegas grew up very, very quickly and just kind of randomly. A bunch of people realized that they could make some money in what was originally just a stopover in the desert for people who are traveling out west, usually to Los Angeles. They started building casinos, and there was because the city didn't barely existed before. There wasn't really any planning involved. They just started blazing with building things, and as they built more and more things, people had to compete what was already there to get your money for gambling. That's what Las Vegas is there for. So we see just an overload of visual information. So even in some ways more extreme than what Basquiat is portraying. So sometimes you have a rhythm. Yeah, there's a rhythm if you go here and go inside and play the games. But it's almost like there's no rhythm when you're out in the streets of Las Vegas. It's just a blast of visual information. So this one, Elizabeth Murray, has a reference to Alice in Wonderland through the Looking Glass. And it's called Just in Time. So when you first look at it, you can see, depending on what you're interested in, either a bunny, so representing the white rabbit, or a teacup, so representing the teacups are really important in the story. So the overall shape, the unity of it, is kind of existing as two things as once, a bunny and a cup. So in a way, it illustrates postmodern unity in a way that, for some reason, places like this make sense to us because you kind of understand where it's coming from, maybe. And so if you have overlapping images, that in a way would represent a certain kind of unity. So the critical process, this is something I might do for a in-class assignment later. But if not, you can kind of think of the questions yourself and try to relate it to this particular picture.